Jake Callahan came home believing his father died a fool, a man who wasted his life on a fantasy. His only inheritance was a rotting boat, but he also inherited his father's loyal dog, Ghost, and that dog was guarding a secret. On the boat, Ghost led Jake to a hidden journal, revealing the shocking truth. His father wasn't a fool. He was a hero who found a $120 million treasure and was murdered to keep it silent. The drive into Astoria, Oregon, felt like driving into a memory Jake Callahan had spent 20 years trying to forget. A persistent cold rain hissed against the windshield of his aging sedan, blurring the lines of the damp historic town huddled against the mouth of the Columbia River. The air smelled of wet timber, low tide, and decay. Jake Callahan, 42 years old, felt the bitterness rise in his throat, sharp as the chill seeping through the car door. He was a man worn down by practicality, facing financial troubles that left a permanent furrow in his brow. He was here to bury his father, Silas, and with him the man's lifetime of ridiculous, childish fairy tales. Silas Callahan had not left his son a home or savings or even a respectable name. He had left him debts, a reputation as the town's eccentric dreamer, and a single, rotting asset. Jake parked and stepped out onto the sagging dock. There it was. The Albatross. It was a 40-foot trawler that looked like it had lost a fight with every storm of the last 30 years. The paint was peeling in long, leprous strips, and it listed heavily to one side, its name barely legible on the stern. It was the physical monument to his father's wasted life. Silas had poured every dollar he ever earned, and many he borrowed, into this wreck, chasing stories of lost treasure. Jake stepped onto the slick deck, his footfall making a hollow, damp sound. A low rumble echoed from the shadow of the cabin, a sound more like distant thunder than a warning. A dog emerged, moving with a fluid, cautious grace. It was a magnificent animal, a full-bodied German shepherd, perhaps 5 years old, with a thick coat of silver and gray fur that seemed to absorb the weak light. Its eyes, intelligent and watchful, locked onto Jake. It did not bark or charge. It simply stood, a silent guardian of a failed king's worthless castle. This was Ghost, the only living thing Silas had cared about in the end. "Hey, boy," Jake said, his voice flat. He felt no affection, only another layer of obligation. Before the dog could react, a smooth voice cut through the rain. "Mr. Callahan? Jake Callahan?" Jake turned. A man in an expensive dark raincoat stood on the dock, holding a high-end umbrella. He looked polished and out of place among the rusting cleats. "I'm Marcus Black," the man said, extending a clean hand. "CEO of Odyssey Marine. I knew your father peripherally. My condolences." Jake shook the hand. It was dry and firm. "Silas was quite the local character," Black continued, his smile polite but empty. "A man with singular passions, a real dreamer." Jake just nodded, the word dreamer landing like an insult. "Look, Mr. Callahan," Black said, getting to the point, "I know this is a difficult time. Your father's boat? Well, it's an unfortunate piece of local color. My company is clearing this section of the docks for redevelopment. I'd be willing to take the Albatross off your hands. Buy it for scrap value. It would save you the significant expense of having it decommissioned." Jake looked at the rotting boat, then at the watchful dog. He looked at the rain falling on the harbor. He just wanted to be gone. "I'll think about it," Jake said, the weariness in his voice absolute. Black smiled, that same polished, thin smile. "Of course, but don't think too long. A boat in this condition doesn't wait." The Albatross was not a quiet boat. The persistent rain drummed on the cabin roof, and the river water made soft, slapping sounds against the hull. Jake, unable to afford a motel room and unwilling to ask for help in a town he despised, had spent a miserable night in the cabin's damp, narrow berth. He woke to the smell of mildew and the gray morning light. And the dog. Ghost was exactly where he had been when Jake fell asleep, lying at the base of the helm station. He was not restless or whining. He was simply present. His silvery gray head rested on his paws, but his intelligent eyes were open and fixed on the wheel. Jake felt a pang of irritation. He needed to make a decision. Black's offer to buy the boat for scrap was practical. It was fast money, an escape. He just needed to figure out what to do with the dog. He started sorting through the cabin, bagging up old charts and bits of trash. Ghost remained by the wheel, a silent, furry obstruction. "Move, boy, I need to get in here," Jake said. Ghost lifted his head, looked at Jake, and then pointedly pressed his nose against a small, tarnished brass plaque fixed to the wooden column of the wheel. It made a soft, wet thud. Jake paused. "What?" The dog did it again, a deliberate nudge against the metal. Jake sighed, his frustration mounting. "It's just a plaque, dog. There's nothing there." He knelt, examining it. It was a standard builder's plate, aged green with verdigris. It seemed firmly attached. He was about to dismiss it when Ghost nudged it a third time, harder, looking Jake right in the eye. A strange feeling, part annoyance and part curiosity, took root. He found an old multi-tool in one of his father's drawers. The flathead screws were stiff, complaining with a high scraping sound as he forced them to turn. Finally, the plaque came loose in his hand. It was not a hidden compartment. Underneath, carved directly into the dark oil-stained wood of the column, were 7 words. The coordinates are meaningless without the key. Jake stared at the inscription, the breath catching in his chest. Coordinates? Key? This was classic Silas. A treasure map. A ghost story. He felt the old, familiar anger rising, but this time it was mixed with something else. "A key?" Jake said aloud, looking at the dog. "What key?" As if he had been waiting for the question, Ghost stood up. He walked past Jake, toward the stern of the cabin where a pile of old stiff fishing nets was crammed in a corner. The dog began to dig, not frantically, but with a focused purpose, pushing the nets aside with his muzzle. He pulled out a tangled mess of thick, braided lanyard. Jake was about to tell him to stop making a mess, but then he saw what was attached. Dangling from the rope was a toy that was clearly not a toy. Jake took the lanyard from the dog's mouth. The object was heavy in his palm, cold and solid. He worked it free from the knots. It was a miniature anchor cast in solid bronze, dark with age. It was beautifully made, every detail perfect, far too intricate for a simple dog toy. He looked from the heavy bronze anchor in his hand to the carved words. A key. He looked at Ghost, who sat and watched him, tilting his head slightly. The dog, Jake realized, was not just guarding a boat. He was guarding a secret. Jake left the Albatross, the heavy bronze anchor feeling strange in his jacket pocket. He told Ghost to stay, and the dog, with a single, resigned sigh, lay back down by the helm, his watchful eyes following Jake until he stepped onto the dock. He navigated the damp streets to a shop near the Maritime Museum, its windows crammed with nautical antiques. The sign, faded by sea salt, read, Hemlock's Curiosities. A small bell announced his entry with a cheerful, tinkling sound. The shop smelled of old rope, brass polish, and pipe tobacco. Behind the counter stood Doc Hemlock, a wiry older man whose face was as weathered as the artifacts he sold. He was examining a compass through a jeweler's loop, his glasses pushed up onto his fringe of white hair. "Help you?" Doc said without looking up. I'm not sure," Jake said, feeling foolish. "I'm Silas Callahan's son. I found this on his boat." He placed the bronze anchor on the counter. Doc Hemlock froze. He put down the compass and slowly, almost reverently, picked up the anchor. He turned it over in his hands. "I'll be," he whispered. "I haven't seen this in years. Your father designed it. I helped him cast it." "Cast it? I thought it was just a toy for his dog." "A toy?" Doc chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Silas wasn't a man for toys, son. He was the most meticulous historian this town has ever seen. This is a key." He pointed to the base of the anchor. "Look, the flukes are precision cut. It's designed to turn a specific custom-made lock mechanism. He was paranoid, your father. But as it turns out, he had good reason to be." Doc grabbed his coat. "Let's go. I think I know where this fits." They returned to the Albatross. Ghost looked up, saw Doc, and gave a slight thump of his tail, recognizing a friend. He always guarded the helm, Jake said, remembering the dog's behavior. He pointed to the floorboards where Ghost had been lying. "Right here." Doc knelt, his old joints cracking softly. He ran his fingers over the wood, feeling for an irregularity. Ah, here. Hidden in the dark wood grain was a keyhole, shaped exactly like the anchor's shaft. Doc inserted the key. It fit perfectly. He turned it. A soft click echoed in the cabin, and a single floorboard popped up by a fraction of an inch. Jake pried it open. Beneath it was a small zinc-lined box. Inside, protected from the damp, was a single leather-bound journal. Jake opened it. It was his father's handwriting, sharp, clear, and methodical. "The SS Northern Star," Jake read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. "Sank in 1875. That's what the history books say. They're wrong." Doc nodded. "I told him he was crazy." "He wasn't," Jake said. He read on, describing Silas's theory. The ship, carrying a massive gold shipment, wasn't sunk by a storm. It was intercepted by its own insurance backers, the founders of what was now Odyssey Marine. They forced the ship to shore, transferred the gold to a sea cave, and then scuttled the empty vessel in deep water to declare it a total loss. "A perfect history-altering crime," Doc murmured. Jake turned to the last page. The handwriting was rushed, frantic. "I found it, Doc. I found the cave. The gold is still there, all of it. But Black knows. He knows I found it. If you are reading this, Jake, my death was not an accident. He sabotaged my boat. This is my proof." Jake sat in the cluttered back room of Doc Hemlock's shop, the air thick with the smell of old paper and brass polish. Ghost lay at his feet, the dog's quiet breathing the only steady sound in the room. The journal was open on the table. "So these coordinates," Jake said, tapping the neatly written numbers. "You're telling me my father wrote these down, knowing Black would find them?" "Exactly," Doc said. He adjusted his glasses, his expression grim. Silas knew Black was obsessed, but obsessed with the wrong thing. Marcus Black has spent a fortune looking for the wreck of the Northern Star, believing the gold went down with the ship. He never believed Silas's theory about a sea cave. "He thought my father was just a crazy old man," Jake said, the bitterness returning. "He counted on it," Doc corrected. "So Silas decided to find the wreck for him. These coordinates, they're real. They lead right to the empty, scuttled hull of the Northern Star, a perfect decoy, a ghost ship to chase." A plan began to form, cold and clear in Jake's mind. "He wants the boat, thinking the treasure map is on it. We need him to find this map. We need to leak it." Doc's eyes crinkled. "We don't even need to leak it. We just need to talk. The harbor has ears, specifically Mitch Finnegan." "Who's that?" "A fisherman," Doc said dismissively. "Talks more than he fishes. He's been feeding Black scraps of dockside gossip for years, hoping for a payday. Silas knew it. Mitch will be by, pretending to look for old fittings." As if summoned, the bell on the shop door jingled. A heavy-set man in oilskin overalls, Mitch Finnegan, entered, bringing the smell of rain and diesel with him. "Mornin', Doc," Mitch said, his eyes darting around the shop. "Just seeing if you had any spare bronze cleats." "No cleats, Mitch," Doc said, his voice deliberately raised. He gestured to Jake. "But you won't believe what young Callahan here just found. Looks like the old man wasn't so crazy after all." Doc tapped a fresh navigation chart he had spread on the counter, upon which he had copied the decoy coordinates, circling them in red. Mitch's gaze snapped to the chart. He leaned in, his attempt at nonchalance failing. "What's that? No, that can't be." "The SS Northern Star," Jake said, stepping forward. "My father found it. The coordinates were hidden on the Albatross the whole time. We're hiring a lawyer to file for the salvage rights." Mitch's eyes went wide. "Huh? Well, I'll be. Good luck with that." He bought a small coil of rope he didn't need and rushed out, the bell sounding his hasty retreat. They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, the harbor awoke to a deep, powerful sound, the low thrum of massive engines. Jake and Doc stood on the deck of the Albatross, Ghost silent at their side. Odyssey Marine's flagship, the Odysseus, was moving. It was a high-tech monster of steel cranes and sonar arrays, casting a shadow over the entire fishing fleet. Jake watched as the massive ship pointed its bow toward the open sea, heading directly for the decoy coordinates. "He took the bait," Doc said, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "He thinks he's finally won." "He'll be busy for days," Jake said. He looked down at Ghost, who was watching the Odysseus disappear into the coastal fog. "He's busy. Now, we find out where you've really been going." With the massive thrum of the Odysseus's engines fading into the fog, an oppressive silence settled back over the harbor. Black was gone, chasing a ghost ship out into the deep water. Jake and Doc had retreated to the Albatross, the cabin feeling more like a bunker than a boat. "He'll be occupied for a while," Doc said, packing up his charts. "But he'll be furious when he finds that wreck empty. You need to find what your father really left you." Doc left, leaving Jake alone with Ghost. The dog sat by his feet, watching him, a quiet, expectant presence. Jake turned to his father's messy navigation table. In the corner, shoved aside, was an old, heavy laptop, the kind built for rugged field work. Next to it, hanging on a peg, was a thick, heavy-duty dog collar. It wasn't the simple leather one Ghost was wearing now. It was a GPS tracker. A sudden, sharp idea hit Jake. He took the collar and the laptop. The computer booted up with a low, mechanical whir. It was slow, but it worked. Jake found the docking station for the GPS collar and plugged it in. A tracking program opened automatically. At first, all he saw was a single marked coordinate, far out at sea. The decoy, Black's prize. But then, Jake clicked on the track history log. The screen repopulated. A dense, bright red line appeared, but it didn't go out to sea. It traced a path hugging the coastline, winding north for several miles, past the treacherous cliffs of the Cape. It was not one trip. The data log showed the same exact path over and over, dozens of times, all originating from this dock. The path terminated at a tiny, unnamed cove, pushed up against a sheer rock face. Jake checked his father's tide charts. The cove was inaccessible at high tide. It became a sea cave. He explored the laptop's hard drive. There was one file that stood out, separate from the research folders. It was an audio file, simply labeled, "For Jake." He clicked it. A password prompt appeared. He tried Jake. Access denied. He tried Albatross. Access denied. He looked at the dog. Ghost. Access denied. He stopped, thinking about his father's obsession. He typed in the name of the ship that had started it all, SSNORTHERNSTAR. A soft click sounded from the laptop speakers, and the file opened. He hit play. Silas Callahan's voice filled the cabin. It was tired, strained, but clear. "Jake, if you're hearing this, it means Black took the bait. It means I'm gone." Jake stopped breathing. "The wreck is just a shell, son. Just like I always said. They hid the gold before they sank her, back in 1875. I found it, Jake. I found the cave." The voice on the recording cracked with a lifetime of pain. "I couldn't move it. It's too much. And I couldn't write it down. Black. He knew I was close. He sabotaged my truck. He was watching every move I made. I couldn't risk him finding you. The only place I could trust, the only one who could memorize the path, day after day, was him. The GPS log. That's the way. He knows the way, Jake. Trust the dog." The recording ended. Jake slowly looked up from the screen. Ghost was watching him, his head tilted as if he had been waiting. Jake put a trembling hand on the dog's head. The 20 years of bitterness began to crack, replaced by a devastating, sudden understanding. His father hadn't been a dreamer. He had been a guardian. The Albatross fought the coastal swell, its old engine a low, steady thrum against the rising wind. Ghost stood at the bow, his body braced against the motion. He was not a passenger. He was a navigator. His silver-gray fur was damp with sea spray, and he kept turning his head, sniffing the air, letting out a soft whine until Jake adjusted their course. "He knows," Doc Hemlock said, gripping the railing. "He really knows." They followed the GPS track along the base of a sheer, treacherous cliff face. "The track ends right at that rockfall," Jake said, his knuckles white on the wheel. "It looks solid. Only at low tide," Doc said, checking his watch. "Silas timed this perfectly. Look, there." As the tide receded, a narrow, dark slit in the rock became visible, just wide enough for the albatross to pass, hidden completely by the breaking waves just an hour earlier. Jake guided the boat in, the roar of the ocean muted, replaced by the hollow sound of dripping water. Jake switched on a set of heavy-duty flashlights. His father had been here. A thick guide rope was strung along the cavern wall. A few battery-powered lanterns hung from spikes in the rock, casting a weak, ghostly light. They tied off the boat and followed the rope onto a wide, sandy ledge high above the waterline. "My God," Doc whispered, his voice cracking. It was not a few chests. It was a hoard. Against the back wall of the cavern, stacked like firewood, were hundreds of gold bars, stamped with the insignia of the San Francisco Mint. They were covered in the dust and salt of nearly a century. $120 million, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and touched one. He was right. He was right all along. A blinding white spotlight suddenly flooded the cave entrance, making them shield their eyes. The deep, powerful thrum of a modern engine idled just outside, drowning the sound of the waves. "Did you really think," Marcus Black's voice boomed over a loudspeaker, "that I wouldn't put a new tracker on your father's boat the day I first met you?" Black stepped onto the ledge from his own sleek, high-tech launch, flanked by two large henchmen. The tide was beginning to turn, and the sound of the water surging into the cave was getting louder. "A pathetic little trick with the decoy wreck," Black sneered. "It's over, Callahan. A tragedy. You, like your father, lost at sea." He nodded to one of his men. "Get the gold. Start loading." The henchman advanced on Jake. Ghost, who had been silent, moved like lightning. He did not growl. He acted. He launched himself, a 90-pound missile of muscle and fur, letting out a deep, explosive bark. He slammed his body hard against the henchman's chest. The man, caught completely off guard, yelled and stumbled backward, crashing into the second henchman. It was pure, sudden chaos. "Now, Doc!" Jake yelled. Doc, who had been ignored, raised a satellite phone he had been holding and pressed the emergency beacon. "It's done, Jake. I told the Coast Guard we were diving at these coordinates. They've been on standby." Black's face twisted in rage, but it was too late. The high, piercing sound of a fast-approaching siren cut through the air. The flashing blue and red lights of a Coast Guard cutter illuminated the cave entrance. Black was trapped. 6 months later, the Albatross no longer listed. She was fully restored, her brass gleaming. Silas Callahan's name was cleared, his discovery rewriting Astoria's history. Jake, having received a substantial legal reward, stood on the deck. He wasn't leaving. He watched the harbor as Ghost, his friend, his guardian, his true inheritance, laid his head peacefully on his lap. In the end, the true treasure wasn't the gold, but the truth Silas left behind, a legacy of sacrifice guarded by the unwavering loyalty of Ghost. It's a reminder that sometimes we have to look past the surface to see the love someone is trying to protect. If you treasure stories like this, we invite you to subscribe and become part of our community. We'd love to read your own stories of loyalty in the comments. We hope you'll continue the journey with us by clicking the new video now, waiting for you on the screen.